Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Sarah Newman. I'm an audiologist at Hearts for Hearing in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. I'm also a proud alumna of Illinois State, and I am excited to talk to you today about protecting your hearing. As you can see kind of from my video screen, we're getting the end of the Oklahoma sun, so hopefully that doesn't interfere too much, although we're not looking at me, we're looking at the screen. But if I'm like any other of your professors that you're working with, this is a very interesting and somewhat awkward time to have to record yourself and share yourself via video rather than in person. I will tell you, I normally get to visit your School of Music every Tuesday after Labor Day. I've been doing this for, oh gosh, I've lost track, probably at least 5 years now, probably longer than that. And I love doing it. I love interacting with you all. So I'm missing that communication, that connection that we normally get. But I'm still very happy to be here to talk to you about something that's really important for your career, for your livelihood, for just general well-being, and that's your hearing. So I do hope you'll give me grace as you watch this, that any of the weird, awkward things, I'm a perfectionist, unfortunately, and I'm sure some of you guys feel that way as well. We want to make sure it's enjoyable and fun for you, so we'll do our best together. I do hope that if you watch this and you do have questions, that you will reach out to me via email or talk to Dr. Collier or Dr. Grizzard and let them know that you want to communicate with me, and we'll be hopefully able to answer any questions you have. So that said, we're going to talk about hearing for your career, some tips, some tools, some general education. Typically at this point I ask how many people have ever learned about the ear in school and whether they have some formal knowledge of hearing, how we lose our hearing, how we protect our hearing, those kind of things. And most people don't raise their hand because we learn about the eye, we learn about other parts of the human body, but we don't seem to spend much time on the ear. Most people have also never had a hearing test, but they've had their teeth checked regularly, they've had their eyes checked regularly. It's kind of interesting that we don't have our ears checked as commonly. So with musicians, it's kind of an important thing to know where your hearing stays. So we're going to talk about that today. And here we go. So some background for me, just so you know, like, who is this lady? Does she really know anything about music? I was a clarinet player in high school, was big into concert band, marching band, I marched drum corps. I played in college as well as in high school, but haven't really played much since then. But I care a lot about musicians. I have a lot of friends who are musicians, and I'm well invested in making sure that you are able to protect your hearing long term. So I, outside of teaching high school color guard and being around the activity for, quite a while, I marched a while ago now, I didn't really think much about hearing and noise-induced hearing loss and exposure to high levels of music. I just thought of it as music. It didn't really bother me. When I was starting my graduate work at Illinois State, I had a friend who had marched drum corps that I had met through another acquaintance. And I said, hey, I need to practice testing hearing on people. Can I test your hearing for practice? And so we went ahead and checked her hearing, and she had a noise-induced hearing loss. It was a pretty mild one at the time, but I thought, wouldn't have thought of that. Never really realized that was going to be an issue. So that kind of prompted me to start looking into some more information, some research, what was out there. There wasn't a ton, especially in the marching band, drum corps type of world. So I decided to do we have to do a capstone before we graduate with our doctorate. And I decided to look at what drum corps percussionists knew about hearing conservation, and whether we could change some of their attitudes about that. So that was actually really back in the day when hearing protection really wasn't that popular or well known yet. Most people just knew about foam earplugs, and nobody wants to wear foam earplugs, so we'll talk about that in a bit. But just that general knowledge was not there. Now there's a lot more outlets for social media, of course, and then marketing. There's a lot more musician marketed hearing protection available, so more people are aware of it, and they're making better choices. So that's the main goal today, is to give you the information to help you make good choices on your own. So I do work a little bit with the Drone Corps Medical Project, trying to educate Corps directors, staff, participants about the dangers of hearing noise-induced hearing loss. I also work with other high schools and colleges. I've spoken at University of Oklahoma, OU, and some other places. So I would like to come and speak with you guys. My capstone project did actually get published in it's in a journal for educational audiologists. Educational audiologists, if you're going into music education, they would be a great resource in the classroom. As you work, they could help do something like what I'm doing right now in terms of giving presentations and helping your students understand hearing and protecting their hearing and the importance of that. So we kind of put together kind of an overview of what we learned from our study and how we were able to help maybe change some attitudes and educate. And that's kind of what I've done today with the information I have to share. So it's interesting, there's things in the headlines all the time. Over 1 billion young people could lose their hearing in the next 15 years. You know, there's the famous musicians who have hearing loss, some of whom have stopped touring because of their hearing loss. I know Huey Lewis is one of them, who's well known for no longer touring because his hearing is so damaged. A lot of people, you know, wish they could go back and change things. So, and of course now Apple's gotten on board. Interestingly, back in the day, Apple did not have any limiters or protection in their iPods, and people were actually damaging their hearing because there was no limitation to how loud the iPod could be. That was before iPhones. And fortunately, as we moved along, they've realized, okay, we should put limiters in, we should set up ways to lock volume settings. And now on the iPhone, or excuse me, the Apple Watch, you can set up alerts to alert you when sound levels get to a certain level. So 100 dB is quite loud. It's definitely something that you can set much softer than that, but it's a great tool. So we're going to talk a little bit about, you know, why we care, and then how we hear, and about loudness, how we determine what's considered loud, not loud. And then we talk about damage and ways to protect yourself. I think one of the most important things is, interestingly, as you, I'm a little bit older now, as you are young adults, this is the perfect time to start taking care of your hearing before it starts to decline, because we know that as we age, our hearing can tend to get worse. As we age, our brain can tend to get older. It's harder to adapt to changes, including using hearing protection. The older we get, the more hearing loss we have. All those things play into account. And we even know that untreated hearing loss can play into concerns for social isolation, depression, even dementia. There's a higher risk of dementia in those who have untreated hearing loss. So all those things we want to avoid doing by making wise choices now. So, you know, one of the first things that we need to talk about is how we hear, right? So I will do a very brief explanation of how we hear, but then I have this YouTube video that I want you guys to check out. It takes about 7 minutes to watch, but it's almost like a magic school bus ride through the ear, and goes over how, you know, the auditory system works all the way up to the brain. And it's and ironically, it's set to the music of Beethoven. There you go. What's interesting is, I think, you know, we probably will never know exactly the cause of Beethoven's hearing loss. We also know that there might be some conductive hearing loss, as in he maybe had middle ear infections or untreated infections that damaged the ear bones that send sound into the inner ear. And we kind of can glimpse that because his ability to hear when he cut the legs off of his piano, sat on the floor and could lay his head against it and hear, would be bone conduction. Sound can be conducted through bones, and so that's possibly what's happening, but we'll probably never know. But what's interesting, on the screen, maybe you can see my cursor, we have the external auditory canal. We have our pinna. Our ear plays this role of collecting sound and bringing it in. So I always tell people, hey, let's put sunscreen on our ears, because same thing with sunscreen. You know, if I wish I would have realized how important sunscreen was years ago. You know, my dad has skin cancer, those kind of things. It's important to take care of our outer ear as well, because obviously if we had to have a part of our ear removed because of cancer, it would change how sound was collected by our ear. So sound goes in, it actually, via sound waves, of course, that you cannot see, hit your tympanic membrane and vibrate these middle ear bones. That is actually responsible for taking air and transferring it to mechanical energy, basically by moving those bones, and it makes it somewhat louder, so that by the time it gets to the cochlea, which is the snail-shaped part of your ear, which is filled with fluid, we can overcome the difference between mechanical energy and fluid. And then sound, and we'll break down the cochlea a little bit more, but through the cochlea, sound is transferred into the cochlea, where there's thousands of tiny outer hair cells and inner hair cells that then communicate with the the auditory nerve and send sound up to the auditory cortex. Okay, so when, excuse me, so when we look at the middle ear, you know, if you had ear infections as a child, if your eardrum ruptured at any point, we're talking about hearing affected by the middle ear, okay? What I'm talking about where the damage occurs is in your inner ear. So people are like, oh, it was so loud, it burst my eardrum. Well, it would take a high level of sound pressure. So like a gunshot, an explosion going off to rupture your eardrum. So that is not what causes noise-induced hearing loss. It is actually occurring in the inner ear, and we'll break that down a little bit more here. So what's interesting is we all think, oh, you know, it's the ear. And unfortunately, because we can't see the ear, we don't realize how intricate and special it is, and because we can't see it, we can't touch it, we can't feel it, we're also less likely to catch hearing loss early. It's kind of a hidden disability or hidden problem. But we actually hear with our brain. Our ears are just the way in. And of course, we want to have a healthy auditory pathway to be able to make that happen. And so I like to use the analogy about bacon. Most people at this point, I would ask you who likes bacon. Everyone likes bacon, right? And if you think about bacon and you think about how hearing, you know, how bacon makes you feel. Like, I love bacon, I love to eat bacon. So when I hear bacon, it has all those parts of sound that make up the word bacon. And by hearing the word bacon, it sets off this like trigger of, oh yeah, I like the way it tastes. I can think of how it smells while it's cooking. I can think of how it sounds while it's sizzling in the pan. I can think of how it tastes on my tongue. If it's just like a crispy piece of bacon versus that, you know, that slimy piece that's not quite cooked enough. And I think about, I like bacon. I can also think, you know, bacon, I hear it's bad for you. I probably shouldn't eat that much, but gosh, I really like bacon. So it evokes all of these thoughts and ideas. And it's because we have what's called a primary auditory cortex. So sound comes in, it goes to our brain. And then from there, our brain can interpret it and send it off to the parts of your brain that are responsible for how it tastes and how it smells and how it looks and how it makes you feel and how happy it makes you feel, or, you know, maybe you don't like bacon and how sad it makes you feel when people are like, I love bacon, why don't you like it? Whatever. And so if you think about the auditory system, we need it to get to our brain so we can launch it out to the other parts of our brain and make connection and meaning. Same as like how you feel if you have a favorite song. When you hear that favorite song, that emotion that it evokes, if you could not hear it, you would not have the same experience, right? So we're going back to that cochlea, and that's that snail-shaped part of your ear. So if we were to unravel that and really take a good look at it, we actually have basically a piano in our ear. So if we took that cochlea and we unrolled it, and we can see as we unroll it, we have high frequency sounds in the basal end of our cochlea, and at the apex, which is the farthest internal part, we have low frequency sounds, okay? So when sound is hitting the basilar membrane, based on its frequency is the part of the auditory system that it stimulates. So high frequency sounds are more likely to stimulate the base, whereas the medium frequency sounds come in, but they're actually stimulating in the middle. And then low frequencies, so very large waves, sound waves, very low frequency waves are going to stimulate the apex. It's very much like a piano. It's very much like its own instrument. It's quite fascinating. Now, I'll show you in a few slides here, also show you a picture of what it looks like actually looking at all the hair cells. But when you think about our frequencies in the cochlea, the human ear can hear 20 hertz all the way up to 20,000 hertz. And when we look at and consider music, musically, A is 440. It's the second space of the treble clef. And an octave above is 880. And an octave below is 220. Middle C is 262 hertz. The top note on a piano keyboard is 4186. So, music in general is a pretty low frequency, or it has a lot of energy in the lows. That includes the fundamental frequency and then the different harmonics of the different tones. And your ear, when it hears these different pitches, of course it's tuned so that, that 440 hertz is stimulated at 440 hertz on the cochlea based on the sound wave. Your ear also does some other things. That's pretty cool. Your ear can be a sound enhancer. And that there's some things happening in the auditory process to enhance sounds. And that may include boosting treble notes, because especially when we're talking, this is kind of a fascinating thing that I notice with children that I work with who have hearing loss. If you want a high frequency sound like s or sh or f to be heard better, you actually want to whisper that. And you think, well, why? Your auditory system, when you're talking, low frequencies have more of a bass boost, I can actually overcome or mask higher frequency sounds. So the auditory system is trying to boost some of those sounds, make it easier, while taking low frequency bass notes and making them a little bit softer. They also have something called a stapedius reflex muscle, which is a muscle in your middle ear that is designed to protect you from overly intense sounds. So if you've ever been a place where, several situations where this has happened to me that you may be able to relate to, is if I'm listening to someone who's singing very, very high, like a falsetto voice, it makes my ears almost shudder. Or sometimes if I'm laying down on one ear and things are pretty loud in one ear, I have a shudder in my ear. That is actually your stapedius reflex muscle kind of like trying to like grip and protect you from louder sounds. Sometimes it does that for who knows why, but that's typically your stapedius reflex muscle, and it's designed to protect you from louder sounds. But just like any kind of muscle like that, it's going to fatigue if it has to do it over and over again. So you can't use that as you're like, well, I have a really good stapedius reflex muscle. It does a really good job, so I don't have to wear hearing protection and I don't have to worry about loud sounds because it's protecting me. Yeah, that's not going to really work. Sorry about you, but that's kind of the way it goes. But it is there to protect in some ways. There's also, technically your ear is kind of a sound translator, because it's really taking sound from outside your ear all the way up to your brain. So this is what I was talking about in terms of hair cells. So we have 13,500 outer hair cells that are set up by frequency. They are designed to communicate to the inner hair cells. So the outer hair cells kind of amplify or boost, and the inner hair cells take that information and convert it to electrical signals up to the auditory system, up to the brain. So, when we look at the right side, we see this healthy, beautiful sample. And I'm going to show you another beautiful picture of this lovely picture that was recently posted on Facebook from Eye of Science Photo Library. And this is looking at the hair cells from the organ of Corti in the cochlea. And it's looking at each of these V-shaped little pieces here are the outer hair cells. And they are basically lying on top of a single cell, which is fascinating. And these hairs are surrounded by endolymph fluid in your cochlea, because we talked about how your cochlea is fluid filled. When sound comes in, those waves form in the endolymph, and they cause these hair cells to move back and forth. Outer hair cells also amplify the vibration, make it a little bit louder, so that the inner hair cells, which is this back row right here, can pick them up, and then they can transmit that signal to the auditory nerve fibers. So it really is pretty neat to be able to see how finely tuned and how just defined these structures are. And I think, also all these structures around it are the supporting structures, the supporting cells, the neurons. They're all doing fascinating things. And when we damage those, we're not just damaging the hair cells, because we often thought, oh, if we damage our outer hair cells, that's where we start losing our hearing, which of course is happening. But what is also happening is that we are actually damaging the surrounding structures, the surrounding nerve fibers, the supporting cells are actually being damaged. In fact, excuse me, a patient of ours who has a cochlear implant uses, typically goes to a gun range, and he doesn't protect his hearing. And he'd done it a few times with no big deal, but at one of his last visits, he had gone in and hadn't worn hearing protection, and he noticed after that he started having trouble hearing with his cochlear implant. He was typically a very good cochlear implant user, always understood speech well and background noise even, which can be hard. And he can pinpoint the point at which he started having difficulty was related to that incident. And most likely what happened is, even for a cochlear implant, you have to have a healthy enough structural system to be able to support a understanding with the cochlear implant. So he had damaged his neural cells beyond, more so than they had been previously. So his implant wasn't able to work as well. I've seen this in my adults who have had tons of noise exposure. Those who have been in the military have blast noise exposure. I've experienced this happening to them. So it's really important that we don't just think about, oh, our hair cells die and then I can just get hearing aids and I'll make it better. If we're not supporting and keeping our structural cells healthy, we're going to have a harder time doing well with any kind of intervention. So going back to this, you can see kind of a magnified look at outer hair cells. The ones on the left-hand side of the screen are healthy, and the ones on the right-hand side are damaged. So basically, when you think about those sound waves, when sound is coming in and that sound wave is quite impactful, is intense, it's going to cause damage to those hair cells. And a damage here and there, no big deal, but over time that's cumulative, and it can result in that damage, and you can't go back from that. The other thing that I kind of alluded to is we're damaging those neural structures in our auditory system. We also are seeing more reports, new studies looking at possible cochlear synaptopathy, which is a big jumble of words, but basically is looking at possible damage to the synapses from the outer hair cells to the inner hair cells, and from the inner hair cells to the auditory nerve. If we're not able to, we're causing basically a breakdown in the structures and how they communicate from one to the other. Basically, if you think about sound jumping from the outer hair cells to the inner hair cells and the inner hair cells to the auditory nerve, there's all these different pathways that happen. And if we're damaging how that works and how it fires, then that can be an issue. And many times, you may have seen articles over the years that have said, oh, hearing loss can be reversed or treated with stem cell treatment or, hair cell regeneration. Well, if that happens, and it's not that you need new hair cells, but you actually had damaged the synapses, you could get new hair cells, like put into your cochlea or however they're going to do it. And you might hear, but are you going to understand? Are you going to still have that breakdown in sending the signal to the brain? I don't know. But to me, it's not worth the risk. Another way of looking at that hidden hearing loss or that cochlear synaptopathy is to talk about the speaker analogy. Think about, I got these excellent speakers, and I sometimes, when I think about talking about this, I think about old speakers, because speaker technology has become digital and much better. But when I guess we're dating myself, we talk about 80s speakers from the 80s and 90s, that if you overdrive them and you put too much sound in, they start to sound wonky or sound weird. Even on my car the other day, I noticed something like that happening, maybe from playing music too loud. I don't know. So, if you think about it, the speaker is just the catalyst to how you're going to hear sound. So you know, if I have a great iPhone 11 that I'm playing on a crappy speaker, it's going to sound awful, but it's not because my iPhone 11 is bad. It's because that speaker's bad. You know, if I'm playing like a record, maybe the record's great and the speaker sounds bad. So it's just trying to think about it that way. If you damage the speaker, it's not going to sound very good when it gets to your brain. And what can your brain do with a signal that's not great? Now, I've talked to musicians who have lost their hearing or are losing their hearing. One of them is a timpanist at the Boston Symphony, and he has to play on muscle memory at this point because he doesn't have enough of, his speaker is shot, and he doesn't have enough of a good auditory system left to really know, like, okay, this is how I'm hearing. So also to kind of show the brain, you know, we know we're actually doing some brain imaging studies here. We're looking at how the auditory system processes information, processes sound, what it does with that sound. And we know that sound lights up different parts of our brain. And if we are not hearing as well, those parts of our brain are not as well activated. So in fact, we've seen studies that have shown patients with mild hearing losses, even just a high frequency hearing loss, so much so that they didn't really notice they had a hearing problem. When they studied their brain, they looked at parts of their brain responsible for executive function, which is the like planning of your day, planning what you're going to do next, first, second, last, you know, just controlling your emotions, you know, basically just getting yourself throughout your day. Those patients had some impairments in their left inferior prefrontal cortex. They fed them with hearing aids. They let them wear the hearing aids for 30 days, and they went back, and their brain went back to normal because their brain was no longer doing extra effort to make up for the fact that they're missing out on sounds that to some extent they didn't even realize they were missing. Because if you don't realize you're missing it, you know, that's a problem. So we've got sound, music, and noise as the next part we're going to talk about. So as audiologists, we want to measure sound, and you can measure sound as well. We want to measure in decibels, or dB. We want to measure in dB SPL, or sound pressure level, which basically there's several different ways. There's dBA, there's dBC. I don't think there's dBB, which is kind of funny. That said, that we look at dBC as treating all frequencies the same, but we measure music and noise in dBA. So that's looking at kind of what actually gets through the cochlea. It's helpful to look at for music and sounds that have significant low frequency energy. What I also want to add is that dBSBL, that's the dBA, dBC, those are not related to dBHL, which I'm going to show you here in a second. There's actually a conversion that is done to relate to that. So basically the literature and the things that you're going to see are going to be mostly related in dBA, which again is the way that we're going to manage and look at music. And when I'm talking about this, we are looking at sound levels, purely sound levels. We are not looking at what frequencies those sounds come from. Okay, and I talk here, about psychophysical loudness scales. If you were to do some experiment where you had to listen to different sounds, low pitches, high middle pitches, high pitches, you would perceive the higher frequencies as louder, even though they weren't actually louder, because pitch can affect how we perceive sound. So a higher frequency sound may seem louder or more damaging if we're thinking about it that way than a lower frequency sound, when in fact low frequency sounds and other sounds can be just as damaging. So I always like to say when I'm giving this presentation, noise-induced hearing loss, noise is the common term that's used, of course, by lay people, by most audiologists. I think it's important to say that I don't think what you do, and most people don't think what you do is noise, but we have to look at it as just understanding that that's a technical term that's referred to. I consider, it to be music, but let's use those words interchangeably if we need to. And then we look at the LEQ, which is the average of sound intensity over a period of time. So those are kind of two things that we're looking at, and we could average sound levels, because what we may be exposed to, you know, a few minutes of really high sound intensities, like 105 dB, and then we go back to playing by ourselves, or we're playing with a recording and we're down to, you know, 90 dB. So it's going to, it's not like just one short experience, it's an average over time. So just to give you an idea of the different sound levels in regular everyday world, if I were to talk to you you and I were talking together in a fairly quiet environment, we'd be talking around 50 to 60 decibels, and 50 dBA is kind of fairly soft. And then we look at louder levels. So 85 dB is considered busy city traffic. That's, we're going to talk about 85 in a second here. 95 is around lawnmower, hairdryer. It depends on the hairdryer, of course. And then we get all the way up to 165 dB, which is the 12 gauge shotgun. So that's where we're getting into that, like, you know, high sound pressure levels. Of course, blast, noise, anything like that are going to be higher. Fireworks shot off close to the ears, all those things can affect loudness. So typically this is where we do some audience interaction. Of course, that can't happen here, but looking at sound levels, if a normal conversational speech is at 60 dB, lawnmower's at 95, a rock concert's 115, what do we think a snare drum is? You know, what do we think? And this is usually snare drummers are like 200 dB, and of course, it seems like it some days, depending. An alto sax, a trumpet, a piano. So these are kind of just in general average sound levels. Of course, we can play softer than this, we can play louder than this. Also important to note that just because you have, you know, 3 saxophones that play, you know, at 96, that doesn't equal 96 times 3. It's a logarithmic relationship, not a, I don't know what the other term is, but that's not how you're going to experience it. It's going to be much different than that. So keep that in mind as well. And this is kind of another, you know, some of these references I have are from Marshall Chazen, who's a very well-known audiologist that works with musicians, and he tried to ascribe dynamics to decibels. And so we're looking at triple pianissimo as 40 to 50 dB SBL, all the way up to triple F is 90 to 110. And again, that's relational to whether you have 3 people in the group, 1 person in the group. I guess that would make a group if you had 1 person, but you know, up to a very large ensemble. It also depends on what kind of environment you're in and what kind of acoustics we have in the room. So there might be a room where there's 3 of you playing in a, you know, like a gym, a high school gym with cinder block, high ceilings, lots of reverberation. That's going to sound different, and that's going to have a higher sound pressure level than playing outside in the open air. Okay. So when we think about all this information, we have loudness, we know how loud things are. We need to think about our exposure. And just like anything, that when we are considering exposures for safety purposes, we're looking at how loud something is, which is the intensity, and for how long we are listening, or the duration. Okay, so it's about how long, duration, and how loud, which is the intensity. So we use something, there are OSHA rules and there are NIOSH rules. So NIOSH rules are a little stricter, just to keep us safer. So if you were to walk in and start working in a factory tomorrow, you would have specific guidelines to protect your hearing. You could listen, in this case, with the NIOSH guidelines, you can listen to 85 dB of noise for 8 hours. That would be considered 100% dose in a day. That's your dose percentage, okay? If you exceeded that, then you would have to wear hearing protection to protect your ears. So past that 100% dose, that's when you would have to do that. So anything over 100% of a dose is considered at risk for noise-induced hearing loss. So we're going to get to some math here. And so calculating sound pressure, safe sound levels, for every 3 decibels you add, you cut your time in half. So here we would do a little more math. And if we had 85 dB of listening for 8 hours, that would be considered safe. Once we add 3 decibels on top of that, we would cut our time to 4 hours. And from there, we could go to 91, which would cut us to 2 hours, and so on and so forth. You can see as we increase our exposure, we have a shorter duration before we start risking a damage to our hearing loss, to our hearing, excuse me. So if we remember when we go back to a snare drum or even, you know, an alto saxophone, 96 dB, you've got about a half an hour before you risk damage to your hearing system. So this kind of gives you an idea of unprotected permissional sound level exposures. So my snare drummers, especially a rim shot or some kind of louder like battery performance, you're safe for less than 30 seconds. So that's kind of an interesting reality. We have the ability, this is actually a study from a friend of mine who I did not realize was doing this study, so it's kind of fascinating. But for his master's, he looked at 5 band directors in Northeast Illinois, and he used what's called the ER200D, which is a noise dosimeter that data logged, so it could keep track of exposures over the course of a day. And we looked at their exposure just as a band director in front of a group all day long. And all directors exceeded recommended noise doses using the NIOSH rules, like we've talked about, from 3.4 up to 20 times the recommended dose, okay, in one day. So that's a little concerning, right? So that said, exposures that are considered illegal in the workplace are accepted as commonplace in the educational environment. I'm going to go on record right here telling you that I don't think and I don't want music to be regulated, because I think the expression of music is something special and something that we all find important. And I look forward to going back to live music type of experiences after this is all over, hopefully. But it requires some thought that we are actually exposing ourselves to high levels that wouldn't be allowed in a workplace. Okay, so that said, let's think about that. What's interesting, on a side note, when I did my study, I had one of these dosimeters and I gave it to the center snare at Phantom Regiment, you know, many years ago. And I said, hey, wear this. And he said, okay. And by about noon, lunchtime, he brought it back to me. He's like, hey, it's flashing this red. And I was like, that's fine, just keep wearing it. You know, it'll data log, I can pull it later. So he wears it, and I pull it and pull the data. And so that was a rehearsal day. So it was a 12-hour rehearsal day, somewhere around there. And this is where I'd have people guess how much exposure they think that drummer had. And I'd get anywhere from, I don't know, like 5 times, whatever, 8,800%, 88 times the recommended dose of noise in a day for one day. And those of you who are involved in drum corps and marching band realize that that's, you know, an 80-day summer. So that's concerning. I have concerns about that, and that's where this gets really, really important. So in terms of, now we know about sound levels, we know about how loud things are, we know about dose percentages, and the reality that we're probably exposed to a lot more than we realize. So music-induced hearing loss. Some of the myths that I get all the time, and something I faced a lot when I was doing my capstone, was, it doesn't hurt, I'm okay, my ears never hurt. Okay, my hearing came back, I'm okay, after a concert. And how many of you have had this experience where you've gone to a concert or played in a concert and you had this like cotton in your ears feeling, you're like, and then, you know, you went to bed and you woke up the next day and you're fine, right? How many of us have had that experience? I've had that experience. I'm sure you have. What that is that's a temporary threshold shift. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But every time you have a temporary threshold shift, the more you do that, the more that happens, the less likely that is to go back to complete normal. So that's a little concerning. The other thing that happens is, you know, you think about like, some other residual things happening. So that cotton in your ear feeling is just not a great thing. My other favorite one is, but I'm young. Oh, and you know, I think with the cotton in your ears feeling, it's kind of like sunscreen and sun protection and sunburns. Like if you get a sunburn, you're more likely to be at risk for skin cancer if you get repeated sunburns. Same thing with hearing. The more times you cause this temporary threshold shift, eventually it's not going to come back as well as it did before. And that's the I'm young. The older we get, the harder this is going to be. Okay, I'm back. We're starting to lose our end of the day sun here. So some of the myths, you know, like this that I hear all the time, I mean, maybe that's true. Maybe you're going to be less likely to have noise-induced hearing loss than someone else. But the thing is I don't know. I don't know if it's going to be you or if it's going to be someone else, but now you have the information. You can make those decisions. What's interesting is there have been some studies, I don't know how much weight to put in them, that have shown that if you're, you know, blonde hair, blue-eyed, light-skinned, you're more likely potentially to have hearing loss than noise-induced hearing loss than someone who's not. I don't know, you know, that's fairly old, but it still bears considering. So then how does hearing problems happen, or how does hearing loss? And I say hearing loss, but I think we should also look at just hearing damage, because you can have what's considered normal hearing sensitivity, but experience some problems that are indicative of damage. So we can cause this damage by exposure time and considering average and peak sound levels. Hearing loss could be due to this prolonged exposure to loud levels. It can also be due to exposure to repeat impulse sounds. So those patients that have had experience in the armed forces, who've had repeated blast noise injuries, that causes damage. A lot of times these changes are subtle over time. You may not notice it until it's like, oh, this is a problem, okay? And we don't know exactly what happens or the stage that it happens, but we do know that in many ways that prolonged exposure creates exhaustion in your auditory system. Interestingly, your auditory system and your ears are kind of a source of heavy blood flow. And so when we can't get the oxygen needed to the hair cells, because they don't get that proper oxygen and blood flow, that can be an issue. What's also interesting is with COVID, we're seeing some damage from people who are even asymptomatic. And again, it goes back to some, and again, like what I'm saying today might change next week or tomorrow as we're learning more about COVID, but there are some thoughts that maybe having this, like, you know, heavily oxygenated, a lot of blood flow going through the auditory system, the blood clotting that has happened with COVID patients can cause hearing loss as well. So biggest thing is once the damage is done, there's no going back. That was one of the things that in my study about attitudes and knowledge, people are like, oh yeah, it'll come back, you know, I'll reverse it. It's kind of like smoking. I'll stop smoking, my lungs will go back to normal, I'll be healthy. And that's just not the case. And going back to that, you know, again, like people are like, oh, I'll just get new hair cells, I'll regenerate them. It might be lost in translation. You can't get, you know, the parts of the auditory system to communicate with each other because there's a breakdown in the synapse. Could happen. Again, some of it's still things we're trying to figure out, but something to consider. And I think, you know, what's interesting is that they did a study where they looked at, you know, fairly, I think, college-age kids who went to a concert. And before they went in, they said, hey, can we check your hearing? And then when you leave, we're going to check your hearing again. They found measurable changes in hearing ability after less than 90 minutes of listening to amplified music, so like at a concert. And those changes in hearing threshold did resolve, but the risk of physiologic damage, which again is that, you know, synaptopathy or things like that can happen. We also see those perceptual changes coming out as tinnitus, or what we call is diploacusis and hyperacusis. So diploacusis is pitch problems, and hyperacusis is just general sensitivity to different sounds. So all that said, one of the things that we can do is we can evaluate your hearing and kind of figure out what's going on. So with a hearing test, we look at things in terms of an audiogram. We test 250 hertz, which is the frequency or the pitch. So low frequencies up to high frequencies, and we have intensity or loudness. So you may look at this and go, well, this is upside down. And yeah, well, it's kind of upside down. So this is an audiogram. If we flipped it over, it'd be called an SBLogram. And we're looking at, you know, loudness as it goes down, just the way it is. So when you look at an audiogram, anything that's 20 or above is considered normal. 25 dB and better is considered normal for an adult. You can see that would be the range of normal hearing. We have a hearing loss. In this case, we have normal low frequencies, and then we have hearing loss in the high frequencies. So in that case, the vowels occur in the low frequencies and the consonants occur in the high frequencies. So about 75 to 90% of what we need to understand speech occurs in this mid to high frequency range. As a person who's ever had a hearing loss or had hearing problems, if you've had a lot of ear infections as a kid, you might have had a hearing loss or hearing problems, or just felt like you were hearing underwater or plugged up. That's because you had hearing loss in the low frequencies and it made everything seem muffled. But high frequencies, the consonants are what we need to understand speech. So we hear people all the time say, I can hear you, but I can't understand you. It's because they had the volume, but they don't have the clarity. So, you know, as a musician, there's a lot of energy in music that's low frequency, but the high frequencies are also important. And what's interesting is you may think, oh, well, since music's low frequency, like I'm not hearing loss in the lows, that's no problem. But we know that noise-induced hearing loss in general affects high frequencies. And case in point, here is a good friend of mine who at the time of this was 30, and he had marched 4 seasons of drum corps, I believe, and then taught several. Was in marching band, taught marching band, is a full-time music educator. And again, same kind of thing. Hey, let's check your hearing, just get your baseline. And this is what we had. So we have normal hearing in the low frequencies up to the mid frequencies, and then it drops down in the mild range. And then it goes up to normal at 6,000 to 8,000. So that's considered a noise-induced hearing loss. That is a classic, what we call a noise notch, where we have this dip in hearing. That goes down around 3,000 and comes back up at 6 or 8. So I can even predict that down to a person who is a shooter or a hunter. I can say, like, I can figure out which ear they are, which, like, if they're right-handed or left-handed based on their hearing results. Another test that we're looking at here is otoacoustic emissions. So we have a test where we can send 2 sounds in and get an echo back out from our inner ear based on frequencies, and we're looking at hair cell damage. And so we can see here the same patient that we saw with this noise-induced mid to high frequency hearing loss, 2,000 to 4,000-ish. You could see that he had nice responses till about 1,500, and then it dropped down to abnormal from 2,000 to really 8,000 hertz. So he has signs of damage. This is a great test to get done as a musician, because a lot of times you can have a normal hearing evaluation or normal hearing thresholds, but we have signs of damage that are seen in the otoacoustic emission testing that tells us about your outer hair cells. So if you can get a screening or an evaluation using otoacoustic emissions as a musician, that's a big deal, and that's really helpful information to have. Some symptoms that you may have that suggest some hearing damage or some music-induced damage include tinnitus. We're still trying to really understand where tinnitus comes from and the generators of it in the auditory system, but a lot of times we think it's kind of a reaction to noise and your brain going, well, I'm not getting as good of a response from that part of your brain, so let me send a signal out and see what's there. A feeling of pressure or fullnesses in your ears could happen. It's not very common, except for that cotton in your ear feeling after going to a loud concert. Pain is going to be very rare. There are people who develop hyperacusis, which is like perceived pain for louder sounds, but the chance of actually having real pain in your ears is probably pretty low, especially for music exposure. Voices and sounds seem muffled and softer. That's that cotton in your ears feeling, that's known as the temporary threshold shift. And then the other problem that we see a lot is difficulty listening in noise. We do have patients who come in who are like, you know, I do okay and quiet, but I just have so much difficulty hearing in noise. And they have normal hearing again. Their hearing thresholds are normal, but they really, really struggle in the background noise. And again, we think that's kind of that speaker blowout. The synapses are not, you know, connecting and firing as easily. So that's kind of what's happening. This YouTube link is basically talking about tinnitus, and it kind of can give you a great idea of a simulation of what tinnitus is like, and maybe make you think a second or two about maybe using hearing protection. So Part of what I did here with my study, in addition to doing some education and trying to learn about, behaviors and attitudes, is we actually measured the OEEs on patients. And we were pretty strict. We said, okay, if you don't pass in at least one frequency, we're going to refer you or say that you did not pass. So with our patients, our participants, and mind you, pretty much all of these were 18 and older, but most of them were under 21 or 22 age outs. We had a few staff members participate, but a majority of them were participants in the drum corps. Only 30% passed in both ears. 30% passed in the right ear only. Of the ones that didn't pass, 1 ear, 10% passed in the left ear only, which is interesting. I was working with drummers. The one thing I could think of where I'd ask you to guess here is if you play set, hi-hat, left side. Also, snare drummers seem to tend to tilt their ear. So of course it's closer. Just some thoughts, again, purely speculative, anecdotal, but when we were kind of looking at this, we had these thoughts about why this would look this way. And then about 30% failed in both ears. So all those things are kind of concerning, right? Pretty young people who are not passing OEEs. So again, kind of going back to those symptoms or signs, maybe you don't realize those are symptoms. But long term, if we don't, care for our ears, we're going to start having difficulty communicating with others. Right now is a prime time to realize, oh, like so-and-so is wearing a mask. I'm having a hard time understanding what they're saying because, for a variety of different reasons. If they're masked or if they're using a face shield, it's rolling off high frequencies a lot. Anything that's close to the mouth, if I do this, we're talking and it's not as clear, I'm doing the same efforts on my speech, but something that's close is going to muffle your mouth. So people, I anticipate for you music educators out there, hopefully by the time you graduate, you won't have to deal with masks anymore, but I anticipate finding a lot more kids with hearing loss that are slight or mild because of the use of masks. So, when we have noise-induced damage, it's in the region where it's harder to hear soft speech and the speech that's important to understand, the clarity, which will affect your ability to understand speech, especially in noise. You may have difficulty perceiving music or pitch, known as diploacusis or hyperacusis. That's just, sound is painful. Of course, if we have damaged, music will sound forever different. And I can tell you that one of the biggest things from my study to take away is people just thought, I just keep doing what I'm doing. There's going to be a pill or a remedy or something to do. And I can tell you right now that they're at this point, again, people are like, oh, hair cell regeneration. Well, we don't really know what that's going to look like yet. It could happen maybe 5-10 years. 5 years ago, I said 5 years ago, it would do 5 years and, or 10 years. And I don't think we're that close. So I would not hang my hat on that because I'd hate to have people disappointed by that. But same with hearing aids. Hearing aids are not like glasses. As I get older, I have to wear glasses to help me see things better. But it's not like glasses. You put them on and you're like, oh, I can hear. It takes some work. It takes some rehab. And your auditory system is still damaged. And it's not a quick and dry thing. And I can tell you, musicians are some of the hardest patients for me to make happy because they have such high expectations, and hearing aids are of course digitized, so they're not going to sound great. And all that to say, like, if you have a hearing problem, like, please don't avoid getting hearing aids, but just realistically know that it's not going to be as great as if we could just maintain our hearing as it is. So that being said, all those things, the good news is that we can actually conserve our hearing, and it is fortunately 100% preventable, or very close to 100% preventable, by making smart decisions, trying hearing protection, those kind of things. So there is a pretty well-known researcher that looks at different injuries and problems in musicians, and I like his quote. It's his ability to make changes, and the responsibility for doing so belongs to the person who holds the baton. So of those of you out there who are planning on being music educators, you're going to be using this information to teach other students, to work with students. If you're in, music business, or music performance, again, you're still going to interact with others, but your livelihood is also something that you have to consider for yourself. So that said, what can you do? So we talked about evaluating your hearing. And so annual hearing evaluations, even a hearing screening, if they offer it at the School of Music or at the audiology clinic. I know the audiology clinic at Illinois State is pretty much right across the street from Cook, practically. And they, have programs that they can offer to you. So that's an option. If you can get an otoacoustic emissions screening, that would be awesome, because that would tell us more about damage or potential damage. It's good to have a baseline to know, okay, this is my normal, or this is what's expected, and so you can watch it over time and address it before it becomes an issue. Wearing hearing protection, whether that's earplugs, custom-made earpieces for earbuds, or microphone systems, in-ear monitors, things like that are helpful. Another option is to limit the amount of time in a noisy environment, so you can take quiet breaks. And with technology the way it is, you can even, I know there are some methods for you to practice without actual sound, just like it's almost like a mute or an electronic type of situation where you can control the volume output and practice the technical skills without necessarily risking the noise exposure. Distancing yourself from the source of the noise if possible. Stay away from Dr. Beat. Okay, friends, good people stay away from Dr. Beat, or at least the one that is running through the long ranger on the marching band field. Those are, when I go and give presentations to drum corps, I'm like, okay, where are my drum majors that are running the click track or running the Dr. Beat all the time? Okay. So friends don't let friends not wear hearing protection when they're hanging out with Dr. Beat, okay? He's definitely not a doctor of audiology. So with that said, doubling your distance from the sound source reduces your exposure by 6 dB. Also, of course, increasing your or closing the distance also increases by half, increases the sound by 6 dB. So consider that. Another kind of neat tool that Marshall Chazen I was telling you about, he has an app called a temporary hearing loss test. So you would take that with your headphones, baseline, whatever headphones you use. And then if you were exposed to sound, you could actually do a test after that using the same headphones and see if there's a change. Interestingly, also, there's like on the Apple Watch and through the research on the phone, you can actually do participate in a study at University of Michigan about noise exposure and hearing. So I encourage you to look into that if you're interested or curious more about doing that. And there's some speech and noise testing and some auditory testing and other things that they're doing to track hearing in Apple users over time. So there's that, and then there's hearing protection. Hearing protection comes in a variety of different options, and that includes foam earplugs, non-custom musician earplugs, and custom earplugs. And this is the point where I say, okay, who loves foam earplugs? And it's like, nobody, okay? Of course, because foam earplugs roll off high frequencies, they make things muffled. They're kind of like masks. They're not great. They don't sound good. Foam earplugs, I always say, are great for plugging, blocking out your roommate snoring across the room from you, or, just really loud if you're working on, with power tools in the yard or whatever. That's a great idea. In fact, foam hearing protection along with the big muffs are great if you are going to be doing any kind of shooting or any kind of high intensity sound exposures. That would be a great idea. And we'll talk a little bit more about non-custom and custom musicians earplugs. And then dosimeters. Dosimeters, you can even get something in your phone that tells you when it's no longer safe to listen. So the hearing protection for musicians, like I said, when I started this in 2010, there wasn't a lot of knowledge. Only about 25% of people had heard of musician earplugs. They just knew about foam, and so nobody wanted to wear it, and I don't blame them. But as more products have come to market, it's important to be a good consumer, not just like go in for the marketing, but also take a step back and go, are these going to really be safe for me? There are some earplugs that are out there that have no low frequency attenuation or very little, and so they're actually going off the premise that noise-induced hearing loss happens in the mid to high frequencies, when in fact we know that music is heavily low frequency, and so is really noise exposure in a factory. And hearing loss still shows up in the highs. It's just the way that the auditory system and the anatomy works to be affected. Because when you think about that cochlea, again, we go back to that piano reference, the first part of the cochlea, when sound goes into the cochlea, it hits the base first. So any loud sound inputs still have the potential to damage the high frequencies before it damages the lower frequencies. Still more to come about learning about that. But if you use the idea of like, oh, we don't lose our hearing in the lows, so we don't have to worry about protecting ourselves from those low frequencies, that's inaccurate. So I would feel comfortable telling you to use the hearing protection that does not protect in the low frequencies. One of the things that you can look at is the NRR, the noise reduction rating. That's required by the EPA, and it's only required in non-custom products. That looks at basically, I mean, simplified, but how well can they protect if a person doesn't use them the most correct. And they give you kind of averages. I think it's also important to look at response curves and specifications, because I'll show you here in a second the difference between foam and a non-custom hearing protection device. And those are just things that we have to consider in terms of hearing protection. So this is one of the most popular, and I believe it's available, or it was available in your school store, which is the Etymotic non-custom Ety plugs. And what's interesting is Ety plugs also have been private labeled in a lot of different ways. I know Vic Firth has them, or has sold some private labeled as theirs. Heroes is something similar like that. My lights are turning off in my room. I haven't moved enough. So typically with those, you get about a flat frequency response. So the goal is to take the dial and turn it down instead of, knocking out certain frequencies. And it gives you anywhere from an 18 to 22 dB reduction if inserted correctly. The NRR rating is 12 dB. But they're designed in general, and all the non-custom musicians plugs that I talk about are designed to reduce harmful sounds without distorting that speech and that music. So if you were to wear these and then compare them to foam earplugs, most of the clarity, the fidelity is maintained. What's interesting is when I was doing a lot of this work, I had friends that I'd be like, hey, I bet you I can tell you who the tick box, as our term in drum corps and marching band, or the kid that plays out, I bet you I can tell you who that is. Like, and they're like, oh, how? And I could listen and kind of be like, oh, it's so-and-so. And I'm like, how do you do that? Well, my experience with hearing protection is that when you cut down on the just general loudness and distortion, is you actually can hear better. And so you can actually kind of hone in on like pitches, and you can kind of hear who plays loud or who plays flat or who sharp or whatever. So that's kind of been a benefit. In fact, I hear people who have used it, they're like, I'm less fatigued. I feel like, I can listen for longer. And those are all things that anecdotally people have reported back to me, whether it's with non-custom or custom. Now these ones have like a longer flange that kind of stick out a little bit more, but they make something that's called the XO, which is shorter, which is another option if you want something that's a little less like seen, although most of the time, when I'd look at pictures of like, oh, who in the drum corps is wearing hearing protection, I couldn't always see it. So it's not incredibly obvious. So this looks at the filter or the output, and these are Ety plugs, and we look at the noise reduction of the Baby Blues. So they called them Baby Blues for the longest time, then they changed it to Ety plugs standard and then large. About 80% of you will wear a standard. You're like, I'm a big guy, I got big ears. Well, your ear canals aren't that big, and you probably wear a standard most of the time. So you can see here, we're looking at frequencies, low to high frequencies, and then the real ear attenuation in decibels, how much it turns it down. And of course, nothing is perfect, but they're trying to go for a flat frequency attenuation. So they're trying to mostly, preserve hearing and decrease as little as possible. You can see that they're getting about 15 decibels attenuation in the lows, all the way to about 22 decibels in the highs. And you can see that again, based on the size of the mass, the larger the size of the device, you're going to have a little bit of difference between one and the other. And then you look at foam earplugs where the high frequencies roll off a ton. So of course, clarity is not going to be maintained in that situation. This is another option, and I like this option because it gives you some long-term security or long-term options. As you'll see in a second, there are little filters here that can be popped out if you need to or want to try a different attenuation, but depending on the situation you're in. And they have options of anywhere from an NR of 7 all the way up to 16. So in these particular examples, here's one with 16 dB of average attenuation, all the way up to 25. So like this would be if you're playing like in pep band or drumline indoors, versus maybe you don't need as much outdoors or for smaller groups. But you can actually make those into custom, and I'll talk about custom here in a second. You can pop those filters out and put them into specially made custom plugs. So it gives you kind of a chance to upgrade over time if you need to. And those can be obtained on Amazon. Both those and the Enemoda can be obtained on Amazon. Some other ones that have come up recently that I'm liking are something called Vibes, which are very similar to the Enemoda plugs. Eros, also learned about to some extent, and they have some apps that actually kind of support hearing protection. And there's another one or two called Eargasm. Don't love the name of them, but they do have some great products, and they have some different sizes, and they can, you know, promote some great noise reduction. So I definitely recommend these as well. And again, all of these you can find on Amazon. Even a quick Google search or what's the best musicians earplugs or earplugs for musicians. There's some pretty good information out there that I feel pretty safe about you checking out. So those earplugs are anywhere from, you know, $10 to $25, $30 or so. If you want to go the next step up, or you feel like, you know, the non-custom ones don't fit in your ear well, or they're uncomfortable, custom musician earplugs are awesome. They are even better at preserving some sound quality. This is the time when I do this on musicians that are in the drum corps, that I try to make it the opportunity to get these there for them. I get these text messages like, hey, just got my new earplugs, I've been wearing them, like I'm so much less tired, I can't even believe it, like the distortion is so much less. I knew people who to some extent weren't probably too much, and they just felt everything was distorted without them on when they were playing music. So I had to be like, don't wear them all the time, only wear them when you're exposed to loud sounds of music. But they literally had to put them on to be able to hear well for music. And this particular person was a front ensemble performer with one of the drum corps, and when he would play, and actually an ISU alum, he would have trouble in hearing without them in. He just felt like it was so distorted. So that process, take my purple goo gun and shoot it at people, but we basically put a block in the ear, and then nice and deep is really important to working with someone who's familiar with musician earplugs, and how important it is to get them deep past the second bend is what we say in your ear. And we make those molds, and then we can send them off to the company to be manufactured. So this is just an example of an ear mold impression, a super deep ear mold impression, and then the end product over here. The pink is the impression material, and then those the clear pieces on the right side are the finished product. And the deeper they are, the better they're going to sound. And what's interesting is this is actually an earplug for a fairly well-known drummer, and he came to me at a PASIC show, and I did hearing ear mold impressions on him. And he showed me his old ones, and I was like, oh, those are gross. For several reasons, the issue is multifold. His pieces were vinyl. Vinyl shrinks over time, so they were no longer creating a good seal in his ear. The actual filter was not countersunk, so it was sticking out. So in my case, and many people's case, when it's not countersunk, it hits your ear and it hurts. It's uncomfortable. But the biggest thing was that this was super short, and so he felt more plugged up. Your ear canal is part cartilaginous and part bony, and so if we get the ear molds deep enough that they're into the bony portion, you're not going to have that occluded or that plugged up feeling as great as you would if you got short plugs. So he was over the moon when he got new ones, because the sound quality was so much better for him, and the look as well. And this is with those filters. These filters pop out just like the ones before with the Westone smaller filters. You have to get the right filter size. But what's great about that is it gives you options as a musician depending on the situation you're in. So we have ER9s that are probably the flat, or the least amount of attenuation. ER15s are probably the flattest response, and the ER25 takes out the most sound. So I've known drummers who are, you know, band directors in front of a pep band are wearing ER25s in the gym, and then they practice their marimba with another kid, and they're on ER9s. I've had someone wear an ER9 in one ear and an ER15 in the other ear so they could hear the ensemble better at the drum corps. Those are different options of things that you could do, but no matter what, the big picture is that they're protecting their hearing and they're finding good fits for the opportunities they're in. Now, if you're interested in these and you're not sure what attenuation to go with, in general, I recommend the ER15s, kind of touch all bases and keep you probably fairly safe without over attenuating depending on your situation. And then going back to these earplugs, this is the custom version with those little filters in the Westone Trues that popped out and went into here. So those range anywhere from $150 to $250. If you bought them from my clinic, it'd be $220, give or take. So just something to think about in terms of the cost. And then also looking at the averages in the NRR. The biggest picture to realize is that NRR sometimes underestimates how much sound attenuation occurs, but in general, the average sound reduction, especially in the case of musician earplugs, is pretty dang good. And this is that particular guy that I was telling you about who wore his hearing protection like just religiously, and it helped him so much in his ability to perform and to practice and hear all the parts that he needed to hear. We had this kind of dialogue back and forth about what was best for him and found a good fit. One of the other options is something called electronic hearing protection. And this is really, so this is another step up from custom plugs, and you can even get these made into custom, have custom pieces on them. But what they basically do is, you know, a lot of complaints I get is, oh, I can't hear my instructor, or I have to take him out to hear someone, and then I put him in when it gets loud again. These essentially work like taking them out of your ears without taking them out of your ears. So when they're in your ear and it's quiet, they act like an amplifier. So they kind of overcome what we call the occlusion effect, or the plugged up feeling of having something in your ear. And then once the sound level gets to a certain point, it cuts it, shuts it down, and makes it protective at that point. So what's great about this is I'm pretty sure they still have a promotion where you can try them before you buy them, or you can try them and return them if they don't work for you. So it's a great investment if you're having those specific issues. The last thing I'll add is, again, being a good consumer of you know, hearing protection and realizing what's maybe not safe and what's to consider. These are some that have no low frequency or very limited low frequency attenuation. Now, I think they've worked, Dubs is no longer in existence, and I think Eraser has done some work to make some of them better and maybe more protective, but I still want people to make good decisions, and I can't say for sure at this point that they're going to protect enough, especially when they're trying to market, look at how much high frequency attenuation, but you don't need low frequency attenuation, which is not true. And so that said, just something to think about as you're trying to decide what's the best for you. And this looks further at whether or not it's safe to use hearing technology without low frequency attenuation. So these earlobes or edemotic ones are here, and the ones you can see that they've got a pretty flat reduction. So it's like turning the dial down, whereas these aren't turning the lows down, but just turning the highs down. Again, and then you have the comparison to foam. So just something to consider. And this is some further information about how it's important to consider the difference between flat attenuation and like lack of low frequency attenuation. So some benefits that you might experience and things that have been reported to me is reduced distortion, improves your sound quality, less fatigue, potentially better pitch perception. There have been some studies that have shown that, especially musicians versus non-musicians. And early and consistent protection gets your brain used to listening that way, and you have a better chance of saving your hearing. Because if you've already damaged your hearing, the chance that you'll acclimate well to hearing protection is going to be great. It's going to be hard. It's going to be harder. There's a lower chance of that being easy, realistically. So if you think about like edemotic devices and like, you know, and again, I don't work for edemotic, but I like their devices. I like Vibes devices. I think, you know, they're, and the true ones from Westone, the true universal, the non-custom ones. You know, when you get the right attenuation, take about 20 decibels off, give or take, you can cut your exposure time off significantly. So you went from, you know, 8 hours, you know, with 85, but if you, you know, subtract 20 from that, so now you're listening at 65, you can listen to that for a very long time. If you took, you know, the 106 dB and you cut that down to, you know, to 20 dB off of that, that would make it 86. You can listen for about 8 hours. So that's a big alternative to damaging your hearing. I think, you know, one of the last things that I'm gonna leave you with is, you know, how to wear them. Just think of them like, you know, breaking in your shoes and breaking in anything. You have to get used to it. It's gonna take you a while. You might think, oh, at first these are uncomfortable. Well, take some breaks if you need to, take them out. If they're really continuing to be uncomfortable, it might be that you have really curvy ear canals and you'd do better off with custom hearing protection. Trust me, it's really worth the investment if you can do it. So again, improper placement means no protection, or at best, reduced protection, making them ineffective. So when you put them in, you want to pull up on your ear. That actually straightens out your ear canal a little bit. And when you twist them in, you want to twist them in so it almost makes a little suction. Like, oh, the ear, they should feel like they're in place. Another option that we have is in-ear monitors. They're kind of becoming more popular even in the drum corps segment or the marching band segment to hear, you know, all the amplified music, which, gosh, all the amplification, yikes, lots of exposures. The most important thing is that when you use an in-ear monitor, you have to have a way to be able to calculate the amount of output that's coming out of the device, because there's really not a ton of limitation when you're mixing. If you're not kind of adjusting for the sound levels well enough, you're going to potentially, you know, damage your hearing. If you check into its Sensaphonics, sensaphonics.com. There's a great audiologist who works with a lot of very well-known famous musicians and has in-ear monitors, and they have something called a dB checker that goes on the pack that tells you how much output you're putting into your devices. I also see people all the time have one in-ear monitor in and one ear monitor out, which is possibly okay, but there's still higher levels of exposure that way, and may not be the safest way of listening. So work with an audiologist to find the best way to use your in-ear monitors safely, and Sensaphonics would be a great resource for that. And they're also located up in Chicago, so pretty cool that they're in the state. Noise dosimeters, unfortunately, I think these are being phased out, but fortunately, Apple Watches and there's other apps that will tell you about your noise exposure, including a few earplug companies that have an app that's associated with telling you when you need to wear your hearing protection or stay protected. But the dosimeter can actually tell you about when you need to start wearing hearing protection if you want to wait till that point, and that's your decision. And like I said, now we can do that on our Apple Watch. There's also a great sound level meter, which is kind of a dosimeter. And that is the NIOSH app, and it is free and it's pretty darn accurate. So that's a great tool. It's also got some good information about noise-induced hearing loss, things like that. As you're working along, you might get people who say, oh man, I can't wear hearing protection because of this, or I can't wear it because of that. Or you might be saying the same thing. They hurt my ears. Well, break them in. If discomfort continues, use custom earplugs, get customs. Another one that I get is like overuse injuries, or people who feel like they have to play harder or stronger to overcome that. Well, I think that's a time for you to communicate and link with your instructors. Like, am I overplaying? Am I talking too softly? Am I singing too softly? Am I playing too hard or too loud to overcome that attenuation? Well, that's a great conversation with you and your professor or your instructor. You can record yourself without earplugs, with earplugs, see if you can hear a difference. My other ones, I can't hear directions from the instructor. Put them on cords. You can pull them out real quick and put them right back in. Consider Music Pros in that case. And this is funny because it's like related to iPods, but it also translates into the iPhone or Android. If you go into settings and volume, you can find a volume limiter. And with that, like, how do you know where to limit your volume? Well, depending on what earbuds you wear You know, some people might want to pay lots of money for the Bose with these noise canceling or whatever. Basically, you need noise isolating. You don't necessarily need to pay for the electronic cancellation, but you need to look into it to find a device that has noise isolating. So basically, whatever you can see here, like for example, is like foam tips or tips that are going to occlude or plug up your ear, because you know a lot of the earbuds that like are from Apple or whatever, they don't suction or mold to your ears or have a piece that, you know, can sit tightly. And so when people around you are loud, you're turning your music up to overcome the noise around you. When you use sound isolating that seal well in your ear, they're sealed. So like, you know, someone's talking around you, but you can't hear them. And then you don't have to turn your music up to overcome that. So these are just examples. Of course, these are examples from old etymonic ones that I've used, but AirPod Pros, you know, with the correct fitting ear tip. I recently bought some really pretty inexpensive ones that had a foam tip that I could change the size to find the right size for my ear. A lot of those plugs or earbuds, you can actually even get custom pieces made for if you want like them to seal really well and use that instead of in-ear monitors. So there's just options. And these are just some examples of good fitting ear tips. So we've got some foam tips here. We've got some flanges that have some 3 flanges. So the further you get them in, the better they seal. Got some that are a little bit harder, maybe don't seal as well. You're gonna find what works best for you. So that's pretty much it. Trying to cover a whole spectrum. I kind of feel lucky because I get to speak with you a little bit longer than I would and be less rushed than I would in my 50-minute class. But hopefully you found this helpful and useful. And in closing, I think this is such an awkward time for all of us, myself involved. I think as you're going into music, a lot of you who are in this class are transfer students or freshmen or, you know, newer students. I just want you to know that I encourage you to take time not only to protect your hearing, but also protect your mental health, take care of yourself, take care of your friends, your family, your professors who are working really hard to record things for you so they're ready to go. I also just want to speak to you as a musician and someone with experience. A lot of us who are pursuing these kind of things and music in general, you know, we try to be perfectionists. We try to do everything perfectly, and then we feel like we've failed, or there's shame involved in what we haven't done correctly or perfectly. So I encourage you to read and learn more about Brené Brown and follow some of her stuff because it's empowering. But as she says, perfectionism is a 2010 shield that we live around thinking it will protect us, when in fact it's the thing that keeps us from taking flight. I was such a nervous Nelly as a kid. As a young adult being a musician, I would shake and just be so fearful of messing up or doing something wrong or playing something wrong. And even today, just, you know, not saying something right during this. And that's just, you know, not helpful for our brains. It's keeping us from taking flight. So I hope that you'll take some time for yourself and take flight and allow yourself to be open to not always getting it right. I like one other thing that she says is, I'm not here to get it right or to be right. I'm here to get it right. And that takes time and practice and vulnerability and communicating with each other when you're just not feeling like you can do it all. So please continue to reach out to your professors and others and connect with them. And I think along the same line as what I'm talking about, you know, hearing protection, music-induced hearing damage, like none of this stuff continues to change. We continue to learn more, and what I'm telling you today may be different next year with the next group of students. But just know that if we can do a little bit to help ourselves and protect our ears now, you know, it's far better than imperfect hearing technology that exists or the auditory system that's just not working the way it is. So imperfections are not adequacies. They're reminders that we're all in this together. And, you know, that it's difficult in a situation where you guys as musicians thrive on playing as an ensemble and are not going to be able to do that very easily right now. So I hope that you'll continue to connect with each other. And one last thought before I close on the mental health, kind of off track a little bit from music, but one of my favorite band directors of all time, my junior high band director, passed away at 87 last week. And I never got to tell him how important
he was in my life as a musician, as an educator. And so I hope that you know how important you are in the lives of musicians, whether they're new musicians, old musicians. Like my mom picked up piano at 60, in her 60s. All those things are so important. So make sure, not even just to another musician or a band director that you had, or an orchestra director or a choir director, but anyone, you never know, and you might not have the chance to tell them just how important or how impactful they have been to you. So be this vulnerable person that can tell them how important they are, especially in this time where we feel more isolated and we have less chances to interact. So thank you for your time. Right now, I'd ask you if you have any questions, please email me if you have questions, if you need anything, if you have, specific asks about your different options for you. And reach out even to the Illinois State University Audiology program. They've got a great audiology school there and an audiology clinic. So it would be a great thing for you to get your hearing checked over there. And I thank you so much for your time. You guys have a great day, night, whatever time of the day it is. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.